Vietnam. This nation has seen unbelievable political upheaval in the past 10 years, having traded one colonial master for another and then back again. Massacres, unrest and hunger has plagued the country, and so it remains. But Ho Chi Minh's struggle here is but a small part of the seismic tug-of-war that is 1940s Asia, and Mao Zedong moves closer to achieving his goals to the north. The fighting in Vietnam only grows more bitter, bloody and terrible than ever before. Welcome to Season 1 of TimeGhost Cold War coverage in our series War to War, where we cover the events of a decade after World War II that brought man from the brink of destruction to the threshold of the stars. I am Sebastian Brandstetter. Last time out in Indochina, which was a while ago, Indy explored the background of the emerging Democratic Republic of Vietnam and its relationship with France, looking at the gradual decline into a war which was seemingly never truly wanted by either France or by Vietnam, but subject to the whims of a few independent actors in the midst of the tension. Indy also mentioned that the war essentially begins in earnest December 19th. But there's quite a bit more to that than it sounds, so let's start there. The Haiphong incident, which we covered last time out, radically inflames the already tense situation in Vietnam, with the numbers of standoffs and other such incidents between French and Vietnamese troops skyrocketing. In Hanoi, the capital of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, or DRV, the tension is palpable and only grows more strained as we roll into the month of December. Various roadblocks and barricades spring up at the start of the month, constructed by the Viet Minh. Generally, they block off areas of the city and make it harder for French troops to get around, maintaining Viet Minh control over select zones. The thinking here is that this network of barricades would allow the Viet Minh to hold Hanoi against any rapid seizure of power, forcing French troops to fight house to house, street to street, and giving Ho Chi Minh's government and DRV regular units time to evacuate the city in case things turn sour. On said December 17th, General Jean-Étienne Valluy, who we saw at the forefront of the Haiphong incident last time out, orders the barricades destroyed by his troops, who have been gradually reinforcing local French garrisons for the past few weeks. This really forces the issue and makes a large-scale confrontation between DRV and French troops inevitable and imminent. Incidentally, around this exact time, new French Prime Minister Léon Blum establishes his cabinet, and a flurry of diplomacy begins between his government and Ho Chi Minh's government in Hanoi. The thing here is that things are really already moving too fast for either side to stop what's coming through talking. The French colonial administration under High Commissioner Georges d'Argentlieu carefully screens which information even makes its way to Paris, often acting first and then delivering a fait accompli rather than actionable information. Similarly, on the Vietnamese side, Ho's authority is also far from absolute, and individual pockets of hardliners have sometimes been acting impulsively and independently, spoiling for a fight with the French. With the barricades coming down and the reports of clashes ramping up, Ho takes the decision to schedule an attack on French forces in Hanoi on December 19th at 1900 hours. This attack is then reconsidered on the afternoon of the same day, following some minor French concessions, and 1900 comes and goes with no fanfare. An hour later, at 2000 hours, suddenly and abruptly, all hell breaks loose. A power cut sweeps across the city, the agreed signal to begin the attack. Moments later, Vietnamese militia groups launched their assaults, taking the French troops almost entirely by surprise, despite some French intelligence pointing to a potential attack. Immediately afterwards, the DRV's special communications team begins transmitting instructions across the country under the direction of Defense Minister and Commander-in-Chief Vo Nguyen Giap, ordering similar attacks in cities across Vietnam, including Dalat, Hue, and Nam Dinh. The nation descends into full-scale war almost instantly, as if with the flick of a switch. Now, why the attacks go ahead in the form that they do, we can only speculate. Taking into consideration Ho's reticence to proceed with the assault after some promising diplomacy, we could maybe assume either that Ho and Giap had a change of heart later in the evening and chose to proceed with the attack, or that their hand was forced in some way. The involvement of Giap and the special communications team in orchestrating the attacks simplifies the issue somewhat, because it demonstrates awareness and intent on the part of Ho's government, and yet it almost seems as if it caught them by surprise too. Have a listen to this. The ensuing battle was a fiasco for both sides. Perhaps the best evidence of a lack of Vietnamese premeditation lies in the uncoordinated and improvised way in which the attack spread. The regular army joined the fray from its positions around Hanoi only after considerable delay, and the advantage of surprise was completely lost in the attacks on French garrisons in the rest of Tonkin, which failed almost without exception. On the evening of the 20th, Ho finally issued the agreed signal for a general offensive, calling on the Vietnamese people to attack with firearms, picks, shovels, and sticks. But the French coup d'etat, envisioned by Valois as long ago as April, had also failed. At one point, Ho was nearly captured, but he escaped with the rest of the government to set up his headquarters in the mountains near the Chinese border. That's one explanation anyway. Other historians have pointed to earlier theoretical plans of a dual-phase offensive, which would combine initial militia assaults to sow chaos and confusion, tying down French units, followed by a careful deployment of regular army units to contest and deny the French access to strategically important objectives. That would make the events of December 19th seem rather more calculated. As the enemy advanced, the plan went. The militia would then fall back to the old quarter, while the regular army would do its best to stop the French from bringing in reinforcements from the Gia Lam airfield, a military base located on the opposite side of the Red River, and from further up the road in Haiphong. The militia would then exploit the maze of narrow streets and alleys of the old quarter to bog the enemy down for as long as possible before withdrawing across the Red River themselves. Whatever the case, whatever the reason, planned or spontaneous, now the war has begun in earnest. The French had hoped to be able to cut off the roads around Hanoi and to seize the city within a matter of days. But nearly 2 months later, the fighting is still ongoing. On February 18th, Vietnamese troops exit Hanoi of their own accord under the cover of darkness. By this point, the DRV government has finished relocating to Thai Nguyen province to the north, a process which actually began already in the summer of 1946. They've taken a huge amount of equipment up the mountains, including radios, telephones, generators, and fuel, vaccines, medical equipment, printing presses and paper, and machinery and chemicals needed to produce more arms. Doctors, engineers, and other specialists have also been conscripted and sent north. Basically, everything Ho's government needs to run a coordinated and well-developed resistance. What they've been able to extricate to the north isn't going to last forever though, and the Viet Minh are more than aware of this fact. Efforts are made to maintain contacts with the urban centers, which the French now more or less control. Combinations of theft, smuggling, black market purchases, they hope, will be enough to keep their war machine stocked and rolling. Some deliberate attempts are made to keep the fighting away from important infrastructure like hospitals, pharmacies, industrial plants, and so on. Firstly, so as to not alienate the civilian populace, but also because these institutions will end up supplying a crucial trickle of sorely needed goods to an otherwise beleaguered government up in the mountains. By and large, the rural countryside of Vietnam remains de facto DRV controlled, as numbers of French colonial troops, Foreign Legion units, and South Vietnamese troops are too small to permit large-scale blanket occupation of the country. The French show of force that precipitated the war has not cowed the Vietnamese as it might have in the age of gunboat diplomacy and classical warfare. It simply drives them into harder to reach areas instead. With no appetite for major conscription and rearmament in metropolitan France, Valois is stuck with what he has and what can be brought in from elsewhere in the empire. French forces therefore find themselves confined to the urban centers and roads. They are able to mount expeditionary forces that push out into the countryside and temporarily suppress areas, but generally find that DRV operatives and peasant militias leave before their arrival and return immediately after their departure. This means that borders and zones of control are constantly changing and flowing, but at any one time, the communists control over half of the country's territory and population, and upwards of 80% in parts of Tonkin and Annam. Rather than just sitting on this territory for strategic purposes, the communists squeeze every drop of value out of the lands under their control. In a truly odd way, the Vietnamese communists turn out to be rather competent capitalists. They develop rural production and cottage industries to produce non-essential goods or consumer goods that can be sold inside the French-controlled urban centers, often through the intermediary of Chinese merchants whose activities make up a sizable portion of the commerce in these cities. That money is then reinvested in markets both above board and underground to ensure a steady income of high-tech or high-skilled products that they cannot make themselves. The French war correspondent Lucien Baudard, living in Saigon, will later remark, "Capitalism is so important to the Vietnamese that they are careful not to destroy it. To do so would be a terrible blow to them. Nothing is currently stopping them from burning all the trucks on the road, killing more of the French in Saigon, and placing mines and bombs anywhere they want. It would be easy for them to paralyze Saigon's economic life, and yet they do not do it. They have even gone as far as to organize self-criticism sessions on the incorrect solution of wide-scale destruction." By now, communist Chinese armies under Lin Biao are beginning to consolidate control over northeastern China and hold their own against the nationalist forces of Chiang Kai-shek's government. So, some future aid from Chinese Communist leader Mao Zedong would not be out of the question, provided the Viet Minh hold out long enough. In the meantime, their forces avoid engaging the French directly whenever possible, keeping their regular forces tucked away in hidden strongholds up in the far north, gathering gradual strength. The French situation therefore becomes quite complicated. Unable to pacify the entire country at once, their plan shifts to a two-pronged stratagem, with the first prong. To combat DRV popularity across the nation, the French seek to install an anti-communist state under the former Vietnamese emperor Bao Dai. It was believed by many French bureaucrats and their somewhat dated assumptions that Vietnamese peasants would be broadly loyal to their former sovereign, thinking that their ultimate loyalty lay with the nation of Vietnam, discounting the idea that the country at large might be supportive of Ho Chi Minh and the Indochinese Communist Party specifically. Thus, it's believed the emergence of a fully fledged and nominally legitimate Vietnamese state would transition and reframe the war away from colonial reconquest, but instead as an Indo-Chinese civil war, where France was merely supporting a nation against a hostile communist takeover. In this new light, the war would not be a product of French colonialism, but rather a more dichotomic East versus West struggle, more palatable to Western liberal tastes. They hope that this will circumvent the anti-colonial sentiment that pervades discourses in the United States and encourage both them, the United States, and the British to help supply the war and perhaps even put boots on the ground. Indeed, the historian Frederick Logval calls this narrative tailor-made for American audiences. Now onto the second prong of the strategy. With the establishment and growth of a new Vietnamese state, it was expected that the South Vietnamese troops might be able to take over various garrison duties across the nation, freeing up more French units to take the fight to Ho Chi Minh in the far north. A combination of establishing a legitimate nationalist alternative to the communists on the one hand, while figuratively cutting off the head of the DRV on the other may just allow the situation to become manageable for France. One is hardly possible without the other. As long as Ho Chi Minh's government exists in the far north and exercises dominion over the countryside, total subjugation of the nationalist movement will be impossible to achieve. But with French forces spread so thinly as they are now, conducting a campaign to do precisely that is equally unachievable. That is why between 1946 and 1947, French numbers in Vietnam have basically doubled, from around 53,000 in January 1946 up to around 110,000 in 1947. Almost none of these additions are actually from metropolitan France, however, but instead tend to be colonial troops shipped in from North and Central Africa, augmenting the existing locally recruited divisions, with the entire thing spearheaded by experienced veterans of the French Foreign Legion. This is far below what they need to effectively fight the Viet Minh though. General Leclerc, who went to Indochina on a brief inspection tour at the start of 1947, returned to the metropole filled with foreboding, telling associates that France would need a minimum of 500,000 troops to subjugate a people so committed to their independence, such a figure being utterly impossible for logistical as well as political reasons. Nevertheless, the first large-scale attempt to decapitate the DRV launches on October 7, 1947, with Operation Léa. This is likely France's largest ever colonial military operation up to this date, involving some 17 battalions outfitted with the heaviest and most modern gear available to General Valois. The northern and largest attack involves 10 French battalions marching from Lang Son to Chao Bang, then to Nguyen Binh, before finally sweeping south to attack the Viet Minh headquarters at Bac Can. In the southern prong of the pincer movement, 4 battalions move up the Lo and Gam rivers on landing craft. The key to this attack is to be the immediate insertion of around 1,000 paratroopers directly into Bac Can. Altogether, the French hope is that a surprise attack from the sky will result in the death or capture of most of the Viet Minh High Command, including Ho Chi Minh, while the two pincers snap shut around a sizable number of Viet Minh troops in the following days. However, from its first moment onwards, the operation does not quite go to plan. The element of surprise is lost almost immediately, as it takes many hours and multiple trips back and forth for planes to ferry the paratroopers to Bac Can, by which time Ho Chi Minh and Viet Minh commander Vo Nguyen Giap have made it to safety, albeit with minutes to spare. Both pincers of the assault suffer from delays, running into pre-prepared ditches and ambushes on the road and sandbanks on the rivers, and ultimately never managed to trap the kind of force that Valois envisioned. A second attempt, Operation Ceinture, goes ahead throughout November and December with similar aims, although this time the Viet Minh are far more alert to the coming threat and are able to avoid a pitched battle once again, albeit with heavy losses as their units exfiltrate to safety. The upshot of all this is that by the end of the year, regardless of what Valois might hail as a victory, the French find themselves back where they started in October, as logistical woes and overextension of their forces prompt them to vacate their newly occupied territory. Viet Minh troops quietly return to the area, stalking the French withdrawal as their shadows. The next 2 years of fighting, 1948 and 1949, will be characterized by a shift from these large, grand campaigns to more disparate, abrupt, and sporadic violence as the countryside becomes increasingly unsafe for anyone wearing a French uniform, and terror campaigns in major cities, especially in Saigon, will serve as a constant reminder to anyone fighting for or sympathetic to the French cause that this nation is very much at war. Bombs went off in milk bars, while agents lobbed grenades where settlers were living. In April 1946, in a spectacular raid designed to stop separatists in the south, Binh's commandos blew up part of the French naval arsenal built in the 1860s. Destroying Saigon, he told his subordinates later, is a legitimate and humane action. While this grenading of the city never halted Saigon's bustling activities, it affected the way people went about their daily lives. Protective fencing and iron mesh went up around the establishment. One Chinese restaurant owner serving a settler clientele finally decided to enclose his establishment in a thick wall of iron. One dined in peace, but one did so in a cage. In the meantime, the communists continued their work in rural Vietnam, taking on new recruits, running propaganda campaigns, and espousing their ideology to the locals, tightening their grip on rural life with increasing totality until Viet Minh territory is determined not by where the communists are, but where the French are not. But altogether, what is the endgame here? The Viet Minh cannot avoid a pitched battle forever, nor do they intend to. This avoidance, the retreats and slippery getaways, they're leading to something big. Having evacuated Hanoi with around 30,000 regular soldiers, the Viet Minh now have expanded their ranks to already well over 100,000. The cap on how many soldiers they can field is about to be lifted though, as the Communist Chinese forces of Mao Zedong stream into southern China, inching closer and closer to the border with Ho Chi Minh's territory day by day. The anticipated stream of men and material into Vietnam is now so close that the Viet Minh can almost taste it. A figurative earthquake at Haiphong may have shaken this country to its core, but now the tsunami that follows such a mighty quake is coming. Stay tuned. Perhaps, like the war we're covering in Korea, Vietnam's struggle with France is another often forgotten and neglected conflict, dwarfed by events later down the line. But exploring it is nonetheless just as important in understanding our modern world. It is the TimeGhost army which gives us the opportunity and the resources we need to cover these conflicts and ensure that they are properly remembered. You can join the army by visiting timeghost.tv or patreon.com. Our member of the week from the TimeGhost History channel is Hugh O'Donnell. All the best, and we'll see you, Hugh, and all the others next time. Excelsior!